to WEC's Reliability in the West discussion series. I'm Travis English. Today is September 4th, 2024. We will be talking about large load impacts today. So looking forward to the discussion and welcome you. We'll first take a look at our antitrust policy. All WEC meetings are conducted in accordance with the WEC antitrust policy and the NERC antitrust compliance guidelines. All participants must comply with policy and guidelines. This meeting is public. Confidential or proprietary information should not be discussed in the open session. This webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted publicly. By participating, you give your consent for your name, voice, image, and likeness to be included in that recording. WEC strives to ensure the information today is accurate and reflects the views of WEC. However, all interpretations and positions are subject to change. If you have questions, please contact our legal counsel. All right, and I'd like to welcome Chris Raper, our Vice President of Strategic Engagement and External Affairs, to the stage to start the discussion. So Chris, welcome.
Thanks, Travis. Appreciate the intro. And I just want to say that this has been a growing conversation, pun intended. Last November, we did have a conversation about load growth in the interconnection. And we did speak to the issue of large loads, and our 2023 Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy showed potential risks associated with the future of large load growth. So the issue is gaining momentum and it's gaining attention, and it is an important conversation to be had because we don't know the impacts yet, but we should all be aware and having the conversation about how these large loads could impact the interconnection and the grid as a whole. In November, we did have Shane Lunderville as part of our discussion, so we want to welcome him back. He is a system planning with Grant PUD. And we also have Kyle Thomas with us today. He's a lead in a large load project that Elevate is performing with WEC, partnering with WEC on. And then Crystal Ball can provide regional utility perspective on anticipated demand. I know that PNEC is having a lot of conversations right now about this subject. So Crystal is the executive director there. So I'm going to give each of our panelists a couple minutes to introduce themselves and kind of how this large load issue is impacting them and their organization. And then we'll get to questions. And I just want everyone who's listening to know that we will take questions. We kind of manage those behind the scenes, but please insert into the chat any questions that you may have, and we'll take them up as we can during the conversation today. So Crystal, if you want to start us off, that'd be great.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate the invitation from WEC to participate in the discussion today. As Chris mentioned, I am the executive director of a utility trade association called the Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committee, or PNOC. And what PNOC is really the 6 investor-owned utilities and many of the consumer-owned or public power utilities in the 4 Northwest states, plus some industry partners. And we are a trade association that brings the power of good ideas together to enhance coordination and to build understanding in areas that are important to our Pacific Northwest region. And we have a long history of collaboration in this region. We are active in resource planning efforts and in the analysis and evaluation of the Pacific Northwest's power supply and the implications of energy policy related decisions. We annually provide an assessment of the power system called the Northwest Regional Forecast. Really what this is a sum of regional utilities forecasts of loads and resources. And we aggregate information provided by individual utilities and the Bonneville Power Administration. And what we have seen in the last 2 years is quite remarkable. And I think that's why I've been invited by WEC to share this regional utility perspective. You know, we are seeing a surge in demand for electricity that exceeds previous PNOC forecasts. This year's update to the forecast projects that demand could increase by 30% in the next 10 years. That is an increase of 7,000 average megawatts, or enough electricity to power 7 cities the size of Seattle. That projected increase in demand is primarily due to 3 things: data center development, high-tech manufacturing growth, which is driven by incentives for onshoring manufacturing, and the continued trend towards electrification. But really, we see it coming from these companies developing large data centers in the Pacific Northwest, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I really appreciate this opportunity to join in on the conversation and share information from what we do here at PNOC.
Thanks, Crystal. We can move to Shane next.
All right. Again, Chris and Wick, thanks for having me back. Sharing. Last time I was here, I was actually a business development manager. So I was dealing with all the large customers. Now I've moved into our system planning groups to show how we're going to deliver all that power to our large customer. I work for Grant County PUD. We are a public utility. We are living this large load increase right now. We have been for a while. We've had data centers for the last 10 years and a lot of growth that has not stopped. We have average in just industrial growth between 5 to 7% per year. It's that growth, and we're not seeing it slow down. And their desire, if anything, we have seen a huge increase in that. Currently at Grant County PUD, we have seen a large request of new large loads, almost up to 3,000 megawatts worth of requests. So that's a huge amount. And for a utility of our size, who's only sit about 1,000 megawatts, that's quite the mountain ahead of us. And so, yeah, a lot going on that's not just affecting us, but this will affect our region and, of course, this whole Northwest area. So I'm just glad to be here to share the information that we've learned and the challenges we have moving forward. So thank you.
Thanks. And we really appreciate our partnership with you guys and your willingness to share your experiences, not only with WEC, but with the industry and the interconnection, so that you have kind of a unique circumstance, I think, in some ways that really helps everybody else understand kind of the impacts on a larger scale. So last but certainly not least, Kyle, if you can give us kind of an intro of what you're doing and how you're involved with the large load issue and studies, and then we'll move on to our conversation with one another.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Travis. Thank you both for the opportunity to be on this panel today. Really looking forward to the discussion with the panelists here. My name is Kyle Thomas. I'm Vice President of Engineering and Compliance Services at Elevate Energy Consulting. And we're really focused on the transition that's occurring across the board in many different domains on the grid right now, which is coming at us in many different directions. And we really try to take a very deep technical approach, coupled with the strategy and long-term regulatory changes and compliance activities that are evolving as the grid transitions. And so this is from the integration of inverter-based resources to the changing distribution system, the changing consumer demands, and of course, the main topic here, large load integrations across the board happening everywhere around the country. All these things are really changing how our grids operated the past 100 years, and the focus and what we're really working on with this discussion and with WEC is, in particular, large loads. What are the large loads doing to the system? Are they changing it? What questions do we need to be asking? What do we need to be thinking of differently with how to operate and plan the grid with this? And the challenge is that it's exponentially growing. And so that's a hard thing for us to overall adapt to very quickly. But that's what we're doing with the risk assessment with the WEC team. And overall, the industry is, I think, working to learn this and integrate these resources quicker and quicker while keeping reliability, first and foremost overall. So look forward to the discussion. Thank you again.
Yeah, it is a challenge. It is going to be a challenge as we move forward. So I don't think there's an easy answer to this one for sure. So I'm going to direct the first question at you, Kyle, just to sort of level set with the research and everything that you've been doing. To level set for anyone who's listening and wants to participate in this conversation with us, what constitutes a large load? And I know Crystal mentioned that there's data centers, high tech, and electrification. We seem to hear the most about data centers. These, in the most recent conversations, can you kind of give us the scope of what we're talking about when we talk about a large load?
Absolutely, Chris. And, I think one of the added challenges is we probably don't even have an accepted industry definition of this. So we're going to make it up live here and talk through it. And that's the first step of this conversation in the industry is what are we really focused on? But typically when we think of large loads, we're really referring to transmission, fed, facilities, very large in size. Is there a specific megawatt size? Probably not right now. Maybe 20 megawatts, 50 megawatts, or larger, that either are directly connected to transmission or have a direct transmission feed and distributed through a whole host of distribution circuits that are dedicated to those facilities. That's typically what we're talking about, the industry talks about when you hear the term large loads. And that does, as Crystal said, and you said, Chris, is it comes in many different shapes right now. Definitely data centers. That is the one that is dominating, if you think about 80-20 rule, it's 80% of the large loads, I think, across the country are really data centers. So it's the big thing going on right now, but there are many other activities and pockets around the country happening as well. And those come from large manufacturing facilities, whether that's chip manufacturers, like from the CHIPS Act, or the IRA funding, where we're trying to bring in-house manufacturing, whether that's solar panels or other things. There's a lot of manufacturing that's developing. That also comes with large industrial facilities as well that kind of coincide and come with the manufacturing. We also have crypto mining facilities that are working to further enhance and grow the Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency industries as they continue to grow and just evolve. We also have electrification of transportation, electrification of heating and load, heating and cooling across the country. These might take the form of, from like a large load perspective, something like a large fleet size EV charging station. Think maybe like a bus depot or a large tractor, trailer refilling station, that type of facility, or even fleets of individual companies that have large fleets, maybe rental car companies and such. Those are very large facilities to charge all those electric vehicles in one place. At the same time, we also have it happening at the distribution level with individual consumers adopting EVs and more, and that's a piece of the puzzle. And then I'd say one of the other last big ones is hydrogen electrolysis systems. So we have kind of a large amount of activity going on in the hydrogen space, is looked at as a cleaner fuel, both for generation, for other burning purposes, industrial facilities, and the like. And with that, how do we, get hydrogen, and how do we get green hydrogen specifically? Well, that comes with a renewable powered hydrogen electrolysis facility. And those are very, very large facilities, or can be. And we're seeing them, being planned across the country. And those are in the, potentially 500 megawatt, 1,000 megawatt sizes and larger that are forecasted to be coming. And they're going to be a whole new activity for us to further integrate those on top of the other categories as well.
That's a lot of information about a lot of different things. I'm not sure, where then we ask our policymakers and our utilities and stuff to concentrate. There's so much that goes into it and so much to consider. I'm curious, Crystal, from where you sit and the role that you have, what is the nature of the risk that large load poses to the system, sort of at large? What is it? Is it just an increase in load? Is it a peak issue? Is it where does that risk lie?
Yeah. Chris, what we do here at PNUC is we help increase understanding about the changing power system. We are very motivated to help PNUC members better understand these companies that are developing these data centers in the Pacific Northwest, so that we can really gain understanding as well on the increasing demand for electricity and how it's impacting the power system overall. This dual challenge of meeting an increasing demand for electricity in the Pacific Northwest while we are on this path to really reducing carbon emissions in our electricity, that just translates to a tremendous and urgent need really to be proactive. And it's like walking a tightrope while juggling this dual challenge. One misstep really could lead to cascading consequences. It's really the reliability of the power system that is at risk during this transition while meeting this increasing demand for electricity. So, I think it's the risk overall is the reliability of the system in this region here in the Pacific Northwest and across the Western Interconnect. We need to be working collaboratively with each other and be focused on proactive solutions. So I think overall that's the risk, the reliability, resource adequacy of our system, and we really need to be working together and understanding how our power system is changing.
Agreed. I think education is key to know which direction to go and where to commit our resources for sure. I know that on this panel, 2 of 3 of you are from the Northwest area. I know the Northwest is being heavily impacted in this regard, but generally speaking, I'll toss it out there to any of you who want to answer. Is this particularly an issue for the Northwest within the Western Interconnection, or is it more broad in its scope and impact?
I'll take first stab at that. I think it is kind of nationwide. We're seeing the development of all these type of large loads across the country. Definitely changes based off the type of large load. And I think, again, that kind of 80-20 rule right now, data centers is the main factor overall that I think everywhere is seeing. But there are certainly really big pockets of key, what we call hotbed data center markets. Pacific Northwest is a huge one. The Northern Virginia, the Maryland area is enormous. Texas, California, Arizona. It is kind of happening everywhere, which is, I think, why this discussion is so timely, because I think everyone is seeing it. Maybe some have seen it sooner than others. But we can all learn from each other. We're all, part of the same 3 interconnections, and what happens in one area at the scales we're talking about here can really impact other places. And so it is it's education, it's learning how these new loads interact with the grid. It's the other side. How does the grid work and coordinate with them well? Information sharing is enormous, and that really does need to happen really kind of across the board, across our interconnections. It's not really focused in any one area. At least from my perspective, what we're seeing.
Jane, can you tell us from more of an operational perspective and what Grant PUD has been through? What do you see as where should we concentrate our efforts right now, right? If you're a utility, if you're working like Kyle is for Elevate and you're trying to decide where to deploy the efforts and the expertise, how do you pick that?
Yeah, so coming back to reliability, right? We have the desire to keep a strong reliability along grid, for the benefit of everyone in that. And so in that, I see there's some operational things, especially with, I'm gonna bring data centers up, of course, that's the biggest we're dealing with, is they also have their own reliability, right? Not really reliability for the grid, but reliability for their own type of services. And in that, which is great, right? We all want to be able to get onto our web browser and find things. We come to this understanding that as they have their reliability, we have our reliability. We're finding that due to that, there is very much sensitivity of fluctuations on the grid, to the point that for us, even we see our data centers from being affected, even to the point that they disengage due to something that's down the road and neighboring issues. They're just that sensitive, trying to protect, know that deal. So there's a lot of operational coordination that we're finding to really need between us as a utility versus them as a customer in this realm. So, and how they also affect their reliability in coming back onto a system, and how that could cause configuration issues. It could also say, hey, we can't just drop all the load back on, right? But we also want to be able to manage those things. So there's some unique situations as we grow and more loads and more into these data centers, the more responsibility we're going to need in coordination, and not just even just utilities, but I think it's going to become regional coordination that will have to happen with these things.
Yes, no question, regional coordination, right? Especially in a region of the country that does not have a market to balance these things out. There has to be more communication with one another across those lines for sure. So is there a chicken and egg issue here with IBRs and data centers, right? Where we're trying to add generation, but the generation has to look a particular way. And at the same time, data centers are growing. Is there a best case scenario here where everyone wins and all things get addressed?
Chris, I'll add that here at PNUC, we really are trying to build communication opportunities with the companies that are developing data centers. The hyperscalers, the big developers, they are committed to clean energy goals. They have corporate goals. And so we are, trying to understand those better. And utilities here in the Pacific Northwest are planning to add a significant amount of new generation. And that generation we see is solar, wind, and more storage. So, it's important to understand what's driving these data centers to our region. They are very interested in clean energy procurement because they have their own clean energy corporate goals.
Absolutely true. So then I kind of have a follow-up ask, I guess, on that question, Crystal, but Shane and Kyle, feel free to chime in. I anecdotally, right, for anyone who's been in the industry for any amount of years, it was only a couple of years ago that transportation electrification was kind of the shiny object that was getting a lot of attention. And the transportation sector was pushing hard for electrification of vehicles. And I know that there are some states who have thresholds that have to be met by a certain time, particularly California, when purchase of non-electric vehicles won't even, new non-electric vehicles won't even be an option, right? And they moderated their approach. My own personal observation was when it became clear that they were destabilizing the grid at the rate at which they wanted to electrify transportation, they did moderate their approach, I believe, for the benefit of reliability, right? And the ability to even have an electrified transportation system. So then, based on Crystal's comments about conversations with the data centers, are we finding yet that we are in that place with data centers as the growth and replication of, right, of data centers across the country grows?
I'm going to go ahead and take this one because we're living this right now. So we're in a unique situation that we've had these large loads come in. We were well looked at because of our affordable rates, a low, our cheap power, and of course from that, that's what showed us on the map, I guess you could say. And then that time it came into the point that we want good carbon, moving to the future, those kind of things really came in. But there's still that desire to keep affordable power in that. And so it's a balance now at this point, trying to make sure we're doing all these things. But even with electrification, you're right, there was a ability to say, here it is, what can we do to manage this? So now we're going to do the same thing. I looked at electrification as we can't forget about it because it's still there. It's still something we have to deal with, but it's almost like we got to go to the bigger fire, and now it's data center growth. And so with the bigger fire, we're seeing ourselves go into that scenario of dealing with that It's a bigger situation. We have to do it. I don't think we have quite as ability to manage in some of that. One thing is, even for us as a concern, is new resources. So we're tapping out on our hydro. We're getting to that point. We're going to need new resources ourselves. But solar, wind are great fill-ins, but not necessarily resourcing for those large loads. And so we know even in our own look that we're going to have resources that are beyond just solar and wind. They're going to have to be, you know, nuclear, whatever it might be. We need something that meets their profile, and their profile is 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, constant load. And so that's where it's hard to manage the ability to do demand response and those kind of things. It brings in a unique world. So I think there's a lot of growth that we need to be able to do in the managing of that still.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a fair point, Shane. And each of you have addressed a little bit. Shane just addressed that they're looking for inexpensive power, right? Crystal mentioned that the Northwest has the energy policies that these data centers are looking for. They'd like renewable energy, green energy powering their facilities. And Kyle mentioned transmission fed facilities. Is there one of those that seems to be the most desired, right? Is there, as these data centers grow, as they decide on locations, is it transmission access? Is it workforce? Is it the inexpensive power or the green energy goals, or is it kind of a combination of all of the above? How, I guess part of that question is, how do we anticipate where these data centers are going to want to be located?
Great question, Chris. I'd say it's without a doubt a mix of all of them. You know, is there a given single one of those that's the highest priority? I think that's probably location dependent, but it's also maybe timing dependent. I think at the beginning of the development, we had transmission capacity, we needed workforces, we needed land, we needed locations, generation, clean generation. And now as those have, you know, connected to the grid and we have so much deployment already, transmission capacity is kind of the really big challenge right now. And that's true everywhere, because at the same time, as we said, we're connecting, you know, inverter-based resources, which is great, getting capacity, but that may change the capacity of transmission based off where they're located. It's changing the flows on the system, and capacity we maybe once had maybe isn't where we used to have it and where data centers need to go. So that transmission capacity is big, but the others they always come along, you know, as best we understand it from the data center developers, is they need the workforce. They need the fiber optic communication lines, right? Latency is enormous and essential. Clean power. So there are a host of activities that, you know, they're always looking at, and maybe in different regions, they change priorities and such at the end of the day.
Hey, Chris, I will add that as PNUC was putting together this year's update to the Northwest Regional Forecast, you know, we were very curious about the question you just asked. You know, what is it about this region that seems to be attracting these new large loads? And we looked into it a little bit more, and we found a report that evaluates data centers by their electricity usage. And the Oregon data center market ranks 5th in the nation for data center development. And what we see in our region is really dwarfed also by what we see in other parts of the country, like Texas and Virginia. But Kyle mentioned this latency and the connection to undersea cables. And so, you know, we just have confidence that we are going to continue to see companies developing data centers in this region, and we really need to plan for this large load.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. We need to plan for it. How do we anticipate how much to plan for, right? You all, particularly, right, Shane with Grant, they can only add so much over time, right? And they're smaller by comparison to like IOUs. Is there, Crystal, in the studies that you have done, which it sounds like are more expensive than a lot that's out there and available right now, have you seen whether there's a point at which it can't be added in a particular place simply because the connectivity or the ability to get the generation to load wouldn't exist in the time frame that the data centers could be built. And I know I keep asking convoluted questions. They're pulling in information from other places that I've heard, but Brandon Suddeth, when he and Steve Moss and I had a conversation last month on same time, same channel, right, for the reliability in the West discussion, he had mentioned that data centers can get built in as little as 18 months. But we all know that generation doesn't get built that quickly. And I find it ironic that when we're talking about generation, even our own studies at WEC show that there are things like delays in getting parts, which I can't think of the term of art, and fill in the blank for me of supply chain. There we are. Supply chain issues complicate the ability to get things built, to be able to have generation. And yet these data centers somehow, right, build in 18 months or less. And what, I mean, where's the balance there? How do we deal with that? How do we address that? What conversations need to occur to ameliorate the risk that comes with that imbalance?
Great question, Chris. There's so many layers to that overall. I think that, it has to be like what we know today is it has to be collaboration between the utilities and the developers. Jane's mentioned that, Crystal's mentioned that. They are long-term partners, or these facilities that they're building are absolutely incredible. They have a lot of features, they have flexibility, they have generation, they have demand response. And so I think overall it's this conversation about how do we work together and use it as an asset to help grid reliability, right? That's a conversation that's kind of been newer in the recent years than the very first we connected, right? That's just a load we're going to be always on. Now it's very much like, being a trusted partner, ensuring reliability on the grid side, as Shane said, but also their own reliability. It doesn't really do them much value if the grid isn't there for them and they're just running on their backup diesels. That's not a good outcome that they're looking for. And so they're pushing, and we're, collectively as an industry really pushing to improve interconnection procedures. Everything we've learned from the inverter-based resources like FERC Order 2023 and how to overhaul that process, we can apply a lot of that. And Shane's doing that, and a lot of the utilities up in the Pacific Northwest around are really working to improve that process so we can get really, kind of guaranteed projects. Guaranteed with a little asterisk, right? Nothing's ever guaranteed in this kind of future looking queues, but how can we remove speculation? How can we get very confirmed projects? And that's a conversation, that's a partnership from the very beginning, looking at their long-term plans and aligning that with the grid's long-term plans. And seeing how we can look at new technologies to get capacity in the near term for some of the more critical sites versus longer term planning of generation. You mentioned also generation can't get built in 18 months. Well, same as transmission. We're seeing that even maybe being the longest bottleneck right now, because if it is batteries, if it is solar, potentially wind, they can get built fairly quickly. Transmission is the big challenge. And so, it is this kind of partnership on both sides to try to tackle that. But it is an enormous one that pushes all the bounds of generation, transmission, distribution, supply chain of it all. And we can't do it alone on our side. And I think what we're seeing is definitely that kind of really strong collaboration between both sides to try to, make progress within the, capabilities that we have collectively.
That's right. I really like how Kyle described this very dynamic relationship. And we know that our industry is changing. It's changing because of clean energy policies. It's changing because of the relationship that utilities are building now with customers that are much more dynamic. And these data centers are economic growth opportunities for our region. And so I really like what Kyle said about this this dynamic experience that we are having in our industry with the utilities that meet this demand, but also with these customers who are bringing so much innovation to how utilities can meet that demand. So it's a really dynamic time. But also, we are very concerned about the reliability of the electricity system, and we have to work together.
Agreed. I think this conversation is proof positive that we know how to work together, and that the the ends are better, right? The conclusions are better when we collaborate to a particular end. And so I'm grateful for that. As a former regulator, I can't help but ask, right? Commissions and then customers who are more and more involved, right, in the decisions that are being made by utilities, particularly investor-owned utilities, I think, want to know how the addition of these large data centers with large loads are going to impact their bill. When we're talking about building out transmission and increasing other aspects of the grid in order to ensure reliability and building new generation, those things all have costs associated with them. And I know often the question by state commissioners and customers is, well, are we paying for that? Are they paying for their own build out? How does that connectivity work? And I know we have policymakers that listen to these conversations each month. And so do we have answers to that yet? I mean, it might be Shane who has the best information on that, and what Grant PUD has experienced up to this point. But I'm certain that customers are concerned as we talk about all the things that are needed in order to be able to support the large load, how that's going to impact bills in an era when there are double-digit increases being asked for by the utilities.
Yeah, and that's a big deal to us, right? So as a public utility, we're trying to keep our costs low and all those things, but at the same time trying to manage our capability to handle these large loads and these growth and everything. And you're right, we're to a point where we're going to have to put some large infrastructure and then even plan strategically in how we're going to move forward with resources and things like that to provide that. And so it comes down to always the cost, right? As I said, that we want these things, but at the same time, does it come down to cost and the situation that happens? And we're at that place right now. We're having to ask ourselves, how much does a large customer contribute into something and everything? And even internally, we're looking at mechanisms different than we've done in the past. It was more like we socialize the grid, that a customer pays for the distribution and connection level. But now it's like, hey, they're getting bigger. We're needed to know that we're building infrastructure. Maybe we need some skin in the game, right? So we're looking at mechanisms to maybe put some money down, subscribing or something like that that's unique that we probably had not done in the past that most large customers would have to deal with. But at the same time, they're impacting, they also want to do it. And they're willing to say, hey, if it's the right investment for both, yeah, they're definitely want to be partners into those things. So we're seeing that, and that's where we're at right now, is dealing with how we're going to do those mechanisms to be able to add that additional infrastructure. And because you're right, transmissions are 5, 7, 10 years out, and we got to get started now.
Yeah, a lot of people would say 10 to 15 years, right, to build new transmission in order to have those connections and relieve that congestion. So
Yeah.
We don't have as many trees.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing in an era of wanting to help the environment and climate.
Chris, at the same time that these data centers, large loads, are popping up in this region, it's also important to recognize the responsibility for modernizing the electricity grid. This doesn't just fall on these new large loads. We really need to modernize our electricity grid if we are going to get to the future that we can imagine. And so just want to say that this is a shared responsibility. Demand, yes, it changes everything, but we need to invest in the electricity system to keep it reliable and affordable. It doesn't just fall on these new large loads.
Yes, agreed. To the extent that the large load wants to accept that responsibility, are we seeing any of that? Kyle, I mean, I might lean to you on this one, but if Crystal or Shane have any information on that, I'm interested in that as well. Are we in an era where the large load doesn't want to wait for the generation that the traditional utility might otherwise provide, and so they look at providing their own energy in order to support their data center business?
It's a good question, Chris. I think that certainly has. I've seen that conversation has been looked at to see, can we do it ourselves? Well, the reality in many cases is that's a very complicated activity to become a generation owner and operator. Utilities have been doing it for a very long time. There's a lot of regulations, a lot that goes into that. And at the end of the day, the reliability of the grid is paramount. There's nothing that has ever beat the system that we have developed over, past 100 years. And our interconnected nature makes it really, really, really reliable to what 3.9, reliability overall, 4.9, I think in many cases. And the data center developers know that. If you operate in an island, that's great. You can work when you're working, but if you have challenges yourself, you put your reliability challenge at stake there in some ways. And so I think that, we see that with the backup generators at all the data center sites and some of these other large loads. We see the grid connection. Could it evolve to they also have a third path in time with another resource? Maybe. I think, they have a level of reliability. Their search for that perfect power is unlike any other customer. And I think we're going to see that evolution over time. The good thing is as we grow the grid and as investments occur that they're, investing in for transmission build out, transmission upgrades, we do know also from history that the more we can grow the transmission grid, the more we can build out and upgrade. And we are, there's still a lot of legacy stuff, but there's also a whole lot of new equipment that's being built for interconnecting renewables and developer data centers and large loads. And that thankfully does help the whole system because it's all an interconnected system. And so the more we can, continue to build out, we all benefit. But where those costs for that build out come from, and then as it grows, that ongoing O&M that increases as the grid grows, those are big questions that, I think we've seen different rate structures and different approaches, but that is a core conversation that is, I think, upfront to many of these discussions across the country right now.
So to your point on that, Kyle, and again, this can go out to any of you to answer, but to the point of what gets built now, what we're doing into the future, is this a near-term issue? Is this a long-term issue? Or is it both, right? Is it something that we're going to be struggling with and or dealing with into the foreseeable future? With regard to data centers specifically, I guess I'll add that caveat.
I'll take it here, and Crystal and Shane, please chime in here. But I think it's here for a long time. I mean, if you think about the uses of energy, right? It was heating, it was transportation, and it was light. Now computing is the dominant source, and I think it is predicted to be the dominant source of energy usage for our entire development for many, many decades to come. Now, is it in the form of data centers or something in the future? Probably something will change. But fundamentally, this computing power, this need for computers and those resources, I think is here to stay. It's a near-term problem, like we've talked about here, of how do we get them interconnected? How do we grow it? But if we think about what we've learned over the past decade in the US, at least, and across the globe, of interconnecting of renewables, solar, wind, and batteries, which is a long-term path we're on with them. There's a learning curve, and we have near-term, but then long-term, things that we'll discover and learn and work together to find out how the grid is changing as these things further exponentially connect. And the same is true with data centers. We're really learning the new operational characteristics. These loads, they do different things than anything we've ever connected before. And so that changes that operational dynamics that Shane mentioned. And in order to really solve those problems, we have to be at the table together, learning both industries. They need to learn the inner working and the deep dive, protection and control logics of and how faults correspond and lightning strikes and all that. And we need to learn how their chips work and how the smallest components at the chip level could interact and, ride through faults or not ride through. And so there's so much that we still are learning, and that's going to go on for a while as we continue to do it. The more we can take from the IBR, area and learn from what we did there and apply that here. I think learn from what we've done in other aspects and apply it here. I think will apply in many big ways, which really comes down to, information sharing, education, computer modeling, they, it's funny because now we're having large load customers where we're running computer models on their own loads. So it's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy type thing, but we can use their innovation, their knowledge, their expertise, their systems to run newer and newer computer models and simulations at a scale we've never done before. But we can only do that accurately if we know how these things really operate at a level that we're just really starting to realize we have to dive really deep and technical and learn their power electronic chip world that we don't know, just like we did with inverter-based resources and learning the inverters. And that is a challenge that's here now. We're starting to see some events across the country, and we need to get ahead of it before those, grow in magnitude or risk. And I know we will. This conversation is an example of us getting ahead of it as soon as we can.
Chris, I have a data point. It's both near term and long term. In our 2024 update to the Northwest Regional Forecast, the 10-year annual energy load growth rate was forecast to be 3.1%. That's compared to 3 years ago when the regional annual load growth rate was forecast to be below 1%, so 0.9%. That was more in line with the trend, decades-long trend of about 1 to 2% load growth per year. But this year's update, we're seeing this 3.1% sustained 10-year annual energy load growth rate. So we see it now, we see it into the future.
I appreciate the data point, Crystal. I am curious. You guys have each worked in the industry for at least as long as I have, and the electric industry, the power industry, is usually the Titanic, right? It doesn't have a great turning radius. They're not historically, the system is not built to pivot quickly for these innovative dynamic changes. And yet we are in an era where that is all we see, right? And so who's the right audience to steer the boat, right? To get the ship to change course? Is it a little bit of everyone everywhere all at once, which is like my new favorite phrase for all things electricity? Or is there an audience that we really need to hone in on for this kind of conversation to make sure that we're telling the right people that there's an iceberg ahead?
I'll take it.
You gotta take
go
it.
ahead,
Okay.
Shane.
Oh, no, go ahead, Kyle. Go ahead.
Well, we can share.
Yep.
I think the movie and the title you said there, Chris, I love it too. It is Everything Everywhere All at Once, and I do think all parties have to be at the table. I think it can be focused on utilities and operators working collectively with the data center developers to really get, all the core departments. One of the things we always like to say is, we always say the grid is the largest machine we've ever built, right, as humankind, right? And it's incredible. Well, it takes a massive amount of people and resources at every given, utility and operator to make that work. And so doing one thing on the grid actually involves many different departments within one area because it's so interconnected, it's so involved, and the data centers is no exception. And so we need policy, we need regulatory, we need legal, we need the engineers, and in that message and that structure, we can't go off on one side and do something, not realizing the impacts in other domains because it's this interconnected system and these unintended consequences. We're still learning what those look like, but we know that if we're all at the table working through this, the hard part is that is slow by nature because so many people are involved. But I think what we can look at is other areas, not just in the US, but around the world that have adopted things in this approach. You look at Ireland and their adoption of data centers is unbelievable. You look at like the EU, they have had interconnection requirements in place and policies for large loads since about 2009. So we can learn from others in the collective, global industry here to learn and accelerate our own knowledge where it may be lacking, and we can also help others in that aspect. And so this international collaboration, I think, is enormous in this aspect. These are international developers, the utilities, we have international working groups, and involving in that at every level, policy, regulatory, legal, operators, engineers, I think is really helpful. And the faster we can do that and accelerate that, the better. But it's a challenge just because of the nature of the system. And at the end of it, we have to stay reliable. And so that's always the first target: reliability, cost effectiveness, above all else as we adopt this.
So I love that you talk about the international scope and how we can learn things internationally. I know, WEC, we have this jurisdiction of the Western Interconnection, and we know who we're interconnected to. And it is important that those conversations occur because we're the ones who ultimately have to collaborate with one another to make those decisions and get that ball moved, right? And yet there are things that can be learned. And so there are other parts of the world where they have dealt with this. We are not the first, right? And we can learn a lot from that conversation. I think that's a really important point, Kyle, that we need to remember to look beyond just who we're interconnected with too, and see if there are some innovative ideas that could be employed by the US and North America in that. And I know, Shane, you had a contribution to this when I asked the question.
Yeah, no, we're talking about, is it interim, is it long term? It's both, and we all agree with that. In that, and I see the importance of understanding that as I've been in the utility world, and I've actually been in the industrial world, and it was more innovative than I get to utility, and it's like the Titanic, as you said, and stuff. And I think it's important for us to understand that in the long term, we need to know where we're going. And when we know where we're going, then we'll know how to do the short term to get where we need to go. And that's why I think it's important to have both of that. And so I think the customers, industry, they have some of that innovation and stuff that we might be able to work with them to get there, but we also need to know where we're going to make sure we go that right direction. So just wanted to bring that encouragement and understanding.
I think that's a really valuable point. Do we all have to agree on where we're going? Because that might pose its own problem.
How do we know if we get there if we don't all agree on where we're going?
We're better off to know if we're going to steer left or steer right. We might not know how many degrees.
Chris, I mentioned at the beginning of this in my introduction, PNUC is a group of investor-owned utilities, consumer-owned utilities, and industry partners. And what I want to share is that the utility leadership in this region is increasingly anxious about meeting this projected surge in electricity demand while reducing carbon emissions in the energy sector, all at the same time managing resource adequacy, reliability, and affordability. So I really want to make sure that I communicate that these concerns highlight the urgency, right? There's urgency here to carefully manage this transition to more carbon-free resources in our region and across the West. So thanks for allowing all three of us to contribute to the answer to that question.
I appreciate you pointing that out, Crystal, that the industry is anxious, right? I think we sometimes play this game of, no, we're okay, we're good. And I think WEC in the last couple of years has tried to sound the alarm on some resource adequacy questions and concerns. And I think we really need to address the heightened importance, the anxiety, the concerns that surround this. We have to be honest about where we're at with this issue, with this problem, with this challenge, however you want to, frame it, so that we can be honest about what the answers can be to solve those concerns and address those opportunities. So I appreciate you acknowledging that it's causing some anxiety in the field. So we only have a few minutes left, and if you've ever been on a panel with me, I tend to ask a last question, like a takeaway. If there's a bullet that anyone that's listening, one thing that you would have them pay attention to as we go forward with this conversation, as the issue of large loads continues to be a premier source of conversation, frustration, and some anxiety in the field, what would the one takeaway, if you could pick a single thing, what do you want them to concentrate on and or ask more questions about? And we can go Crystal, Shane, and Kyle. It's how you show up on my screen.
Well, thanks, Chris. I, thought about how I wanted to end this and to be quick on it. I've talked a lot about coordination, collaboration, working together. I really believe that careful coordination needs to include, planning for retiring baseload generation resources, really ensuring, a stable fuel supply for our power plants, and also in planning for the adoption of advanced technologies. We don't see advanced technology showing up in the forecast, but they have a profound ability, or they could profoundly change the power landscape. So really, I want to emphasize that careful coordination across the Western Interconnect is it's extraordinarily important at this time.
Thanks, Crystal. Shane?
Yeah, I just quickly, if I had to put it all together, is these large loads are coming. Even if it's half of what it, and we're for 15%, not 30%, it's large. And so we're going to see many challenges coming up within resources, transmission, and all that. And I just want to make sure as we move all these things and we have all these pieces going on and regulatory things and construction and supply chains, all these things happening all at once, that importance of keeping that sustainability, that reliability, we got to watch it. It's going to be some really good, strong monitoring. And like I said, it might be initiative way, interesting ways in how we do that, but that's going to be some challenges we need to look at.
I love the plug for reliability, Shane. I appreciate that for my seat at WIC. Kyle.
Yeah, I've been thinking about how best to phrase this well quickly, Crystal. I would say, can we learn from what we've done over the past decade with inverter-based resources and apply it proactively, even though data centers are here and it's growing and they're already connected, but that exponential growth is here and we know we're bad at exponential growth fundamentally. But can we get ahead of it? Can we proactively apply many of what we learned with inverter-based resources, interconnection requirements, regulations? This is an area where I think there is a voice that we continue to hear about. We need more regulation and sense with these data centers, partly because they're just so new, and there is certainly a confidentiality of what data centers go on right there. It is a very competitive space. And so there's a lack of information at times, rightly so. But for us to integrate and stay reliable as these things work, we need information. We need to share on both sides as much as possible so that we can really start to study, as Shane kind of mentioned, start to study this going forward and the problem. And with lack of information, those studies are difficult, if impossible, to run. We should still start and try and figure out where our gaps of knowledge are and partner with them to get information, get data, get models, and then learn from these real operations with monitoring data and get that cycle as fast as possible. And I think we can apply what some other countries around the world have already done to put some of those kind of requirements in place that look very similar on its surface to what we did with inverter-based resources. And so that's maybe a call for not just resource planners and commissioners, but just kind of everyone of, we can do that now and be proactive, where we're not necessarily having event after event and then starting to be reactive. It would be, not that we're always that way. We're very proactive in many, many ways, but in this case, we see it coming and how can we get ahead of it? And that's just some of the recommendations I've got.
Okay, so along with everything everywhere all at once, which I do use a lot because I think it applies in a lot of circumstances, I love, Kyle, what you just said. I wrote it down. I'm going to steal it because I think it's really valuable. And that is, we should still start and try. Like, we can't be, paralysis by analysis is not an option. So if you hear me repeat that, I'll give attribution.
Please,
but
anytime.
I love that. We should
Anytime.
still start and try.
Yes.
And
yes.
we're at the end of the hour. I know we could talk for longer. I'm so appreciative of all of your knowledge in this space and your willingness to share it with me. I learn something new every time I have conversations with people like you on these calls, in these sessions and discussions. And so Cannot thank you enough. I believe this will be a continued dialogue with WEC, with you all going forward. And to the extent that we can be a part of that conversation and advance the ball, then we absolutely want to do that. So thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it back to Travis to wrap us up.
Great, Chris, thank you. To Kyle, Shane, and Crystal, we appreciate you taking the time to join us. Mark your calendars. On the 2nd of October, we'll continue the reliability discussion. And then one last thing to note, WEC will be posting a recording to this conversation on WEC.org. I've had several people ask about that. So after it's available for posting, we'll be posting the recording. So again, thank you all so much for joining us and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you so much.